Welcome back to our deep dive into the Wendigo. If you haven't listened to our first episode on this topic, you need to go listen to it, or else the concepts and context we mention in this episode won't make a lot of sense. I again offer the disclaimer that I'm not, at least to my knowledge, of Native American or First Nation descent. This has been a project spanning months of research via numerous articles, books, historical records, and assistance from within one of these communities. I'm in no way trying to speak for or personally represent these groups or their beliefs. All of my sources can be found on the main site, and if I missed some information, you can email me at backawayslowlypodcast@gmail.com. So without further ado, let's dive into what happened once the settlers arrived on the scene. As early as 1633, recordings began to appear. This one reading, quote, "large unknown animals which they believed were devils," which is almost certainly a reference to the Windigo, which these newcomers wouldn't be familiar with. Since a good number of these newcomers were missionaries or of a Christian faith, it's important to remember that they viewed everything through a Christian lens. Bad things were simply the work of the devil. However, it's imperative to remember that the native peoples didn't have the devil. Many didn't have a concept for a big bad guy in the sense of the Christian devil. However, this was the only comparison that many of these Christian settlers could comprehend. They reported these monsters as the natives' version of the devil, which massively simplified a lot of important context, as we discussed in the first episode. And so begins the distortion of the original Wendigo lore. Let's look at some examples of this. In 1636, Father Paul Lejeune wrote in a letter, quote, "This demon, or rather this devilish woman, for it was this shameless person who made them believe that it was the Manitou who spoke, added that he had eaten some Atikamegaoikin. These are tribes that live north of the river, which is called the Tree Rivers, and that he would eat a great many more of them if he were not called elsewhere, but that Atchen, a sort of werewolf, would come in his place to devour them if they made a village, as they had decided to do. That he would come to get them, even up to the French fort. That he would slaughter the French themselves." It's in this very first example that we read the most popular comparison for the Windigo amongst settlers, the werewolf, or Loup Garou. Now this took me aback for a time. A giant icy skeleton with a heart of ice versus a transforming hairy wolf man? These seem kind of far from each other. However, as I read on, these two creatures grew closer and closer at a rapid rate. DeSanti tracks cross-cultural interactions between the French voyageurs, who were fur trappers that traveled incredibly far, and the Ojibwe communities around the Great Lake regions. Voyagers grew up surrounded by stories of supernatural monsters, and of werewolves in particular. The Ojibwe's cannibal monster contained some of the same features. Both of these conditions started with a normal human, then transforming them into a beast that would go on to hunt, attack, and devour their fellow man. The terror of isolation that was felt by the Algonquian small family groups was also felt by the French fur trappers, who ventured so far away into the bitter cold, out of reach of rescue. When the missionaries and French fur trappers witnessed the conditions that these tribes withstood constantly throughout their lives, they were sympathetic to their struggles and impressed by their resilience. What's fascinating is that this connection contributed to a kind of trade agreement between the voyageurs and Algonquian-speaking communities. The voyageurs took the belief in this monster as sincerely as they did the werewolf. It was something they had in common, something they could all understand, even if it was fear. Despite the positive benefit of having common monsters, the effects of the settlers and their customs were too devastating to the Algonquian way of life to go ignored. These new European groups didn't practice cyclical hunting as the tribes did. There was no grace period for nature to bounce back and replenish itself. No, resources, furs, and profits were far too important compared to the mere need to survive. These companies were after wealth, consumption for financial gain above the greater equilibrium of nature. And as the years went by of these profitable pursuits carving deeper and deeper into the north, steadily consuming everything they could, the symbolism of the Wendigo began to expand. Before, the Wendigo was a cautionary tale against individual greed and a warning about an imbalanced lifestyle. This didn't change, but the potential Wendigo did. Instead of fearing the individual being possessed from within, the concept of the Wendigo became entwined with the practices of the Europeans, who were continuously taking or destroying everything they could grasp. On the European side, colonizers and missionaries began to view the Wendigo as a justification for exploitation. And since the term Wendigo was an Algonquian creature, it didn't take long for Europeans to claim that the Algonquian people themselves were to be feared. These savages had within them the ability to turn into a horrible cannibalistic beast. Louis Morano's paper from 1981, Wendigo Psychosis, is divisive to say the least, but how he described the early days of Wendigo study is important. Quote, "With some exceptions, those who have studied Wendigo thus far have extracted one aspect of Northern Algonquian folk belief from its cultural and environmental context, and enshrined it in an anthropological cliché. This procedure has done justice neither to the Algonquian folk model nor to attempts at a science of history. These studies imply that if we are in the company of a Northern Algonquian, we need be concerned lest he or she, for no apparent reason, be seized by the overpowering urge to dismember and eat us." This was, of course, ignoring that cannibalism has occurred in every culture in the world, and usually in the exact same circumstances as Wendigo cannibalism. No, they wouldn't mention that. They instead focused on how these animalistic people needed to be controlled, and, to the missionaries, saved by the church. "Fear not, savages, for I'm a disciple of God, a God who will swoop in to save you from your demons, if only you do everything we say, and give up all that you are." Well, now we've reviewed how the belief in similar monsters can help two vastly different cultures relate to each other, but how this can also be ignored in the pursuit of power. But European settlers would provide something that hadn't yet existed: written records. Many native peoples function via oral tradition, but now we start to see reports going back hundreds of years about this mysterious creature. So let's take a look at some of those reports, as well as a few court cases involving the fledgling law versus the spirits of the old world. Before we start, it's important to know that the fur traders, missionaries, and explorers who wrote of the Wendigo cases were writing primarily secondhand, and even in the cases where they were firsthand, they wrote of these cannibals being ostracized or executed, that they'd been unexplainably compelled to murder and consume their companions. However, these annotators didn't ask for, nor explore the cultural contexts of how these incidents happened. Without this context, these native peoples appear cold, ruthless, and violent, even towards their own people. This is the perspective being perpetuated by many of these written reports. These reports were then circulated to other European readers, molding their own views. As the Northwest Mounted Police, or the NWMP, brought in some of these afflicted persons, who were then put on trial, some of these cases began to be referred to as the Windigo trials. But let's go back to some of the earliest recordings. In 1741, Hudson Bay Company employee Churchill reported that a cannibalism-related crime had occurred. Churchill wrote of a Cree hunter who killed and consumed a number of his family, despite there being game animals available nearby. In 1767, Alexander Henry was with a band of men north of Lake Superior. Another man joined their group during the winter, and that's where we'll jump into Henry's report. Quote, "The Indians entertain an opinion that the man who has once made human flesh his food will never afterwards be satisfied with any other. It is probable that we saw things through the medium of our prejudices, but I confess that this disturbing object appeared to verify the doctrine. He ate with relish nothing that was given to him, but, indifferent to the food prepared, fixed his eyes continually on the children, which were in the Indian lodge, and frequently exclaimed, quote, 'How fat they are.' Henry tried to give this man the benefit of the doubt, that since the man had been starving and alone for so long, that maybe it was understandable that he would be so fixated on the children looking fat, as it meant they had access to food. Perhaps this is true, but then the Ojibwe man continued to refuse conventional food and continued to make comments about the children. Henry went on to write, quote, "His behavior was considered, and not less naturally, as marked with the most alarming symptoms, and the Indians, apprehensive that he would prey on these children, resolved on putting him to death." In 1772, a, quote, "deranged individual" had committed famine cannibalism. However, according to the report, the Cree man was executed by his family after, quote, "confinement" had proved ineffective. The Cree man defined himself as a Wendigo and had a history of approaching the edge of succumbing to the condition. It's unclear if there were efforts undertaken by the family or community to cure this person, or what those efforts may have been. Explorer Samuel Hearne was an officer of the Hudson Bay Company and often found himself in close companionship with the Cree, traveling and frequently wintering with them. In 1775, spring finally came and broke their isolation. Hearne was helping to build a house when a native man named Wapoos, which translates to hare, the animal, walked into the settlement. The other tribe members were immediately suspicious. For a solitary native who'd claimed to have survived the winter alone, he looked very fed. He was also unarmed, without gun or ammunition. How had he hunted or defended himself throughout the entire winter alone, without any weapon at all? Wapoos all but confirmed their suspicions when he went through great efforts to hide his bag of provisions, stashing it in a lofty pine tree. Understanding the seriousness of the potential situation, Hearne invited Wapoos into his own home. While Hearne distracted Wapoos, a few native women examined the bag that was brought down from the tree. They found what they were convinced was human meat inside. It's here in Hearne's writings that we see him respond with stunned disbelief at the actions of the native tribe. Quote, "Many of the men cleaned and loaded their guns. Others had their bows and arrows ready, and even the women took possession of the hatchets to kill this poor, inoffensive wretch for no crime but that of traveling about 200 miles by himself, unassisted by firearms for support in his journey." But Hearne was missing that it was required for a potential Wendigo to be honest about their condition and how it transpired. By concealing this, Wapoos had sealed his own fate. George Nelson was a fur trade clerk with the XY Company, the Northwest Company, and the Hudson Bay Company from 1802 to 1823. In the book The Orders of the Dreamed, which published Nelson's writings in 1988, it's written of Nelson, quote, "Among Anglo-Canadian fur traders of the early 19th century, George Nelson stands out for his interest in the life and ways of the natives he encountered. His writings testify to his willingness to listen seriously, and with a relatively open mind, to what his Ojibwa and Cree associates had to tell him, and to his attention to detail and eagerness for accuracy." Nelson writes of one instance where a haggard, wild-looking woman appeared at a house. When she was questioned, her answers were vague and contradictory. Further suspicion arose when the people smelled an extraordinary stench from her as she sat before the hot chimney. Not long after her arrival, local dogs brought in part of a human shoulder from the road she'd traveled down. Despite this, or perhaps because of this, she was given directions to a camp not far away. As soon as she arrived, the natives immediately knew what had happened. In their attempt to help her, they gave her something to eat, mainly marrow fat, in accordance with the belief that hot fat or grease could melt a Wendigo's heart. However, the woman's actions seemed to grow more and more alarming. Quote, "Everything she did and said, notwithstanding her great caution, betrayed her. She took up some of the children of her acquaintances to kiss, as is customary, but would have given it a bite had they not taken it from her. They watched her narrowly. All the men slept in one hut with her. She pretended to be asleep till she imagined the others were, then rose very cautiously and was beginning to prepare herself for action. One of the men perceived this, rose upon her with an axe. Even though the blow was violent and upon the head, she would have killed him had not the others interfered. Her wretched fate was soon decided. In 1887, the half-starved and, quote, half-mad woman stumbled through the deep snow into Fort Vermilion and was quickly taken under the care of the Anglican missionaries of Athabasca. Bishop Young reported in his CMS journal that this strange woman had been forced to commit famine cannibalism after several of her party died. It was written that this woman had shot and consumed her own sister. Interestingly, according to this record, the other members of the Cree band requested that the Northwest Mounted Police arrest her, stating that they'd have no choice but to kill her if she remained with them. However, the Edmonton Bulletin had a history of reporting very sensationally, so one should take this report with a grain of salt. Quote, "The woman who is the cause of the present cases of cannibalism turned Wendigo some years ago and killed and ate one of her children before she was suspected. Having once tasted human blood, she is supposed by the Indians to be endowed with supernatural powers, and they are in such terror of her that attempts have been made to kill her. At intervals of 4 or 5 months, her cravings for human blood returns, and while in these fits, it is reported she assails the first person she meets. Most of her children have fallen victims, having been slain with an axe. The half-breeds and Indians are in terror, and it is probable a police force will be sent to Peace River to arrest the man-eater." The next year, the same paper reported on the same woman. However, this time they claimed that she'd killed and eaten a dozen people. Needless to say, I'm skeptical of everyone's reporting of this incident. This next report is from the book Wetiko Accounts from the James Bay Cree, and is more detailed as it occurred within the family of one of the reporters. The area was up in Moose Factory, which is in Ontario, Canada, near the mouth of the Moose River, the event taking place in 1892. There was a family where its members, one by one, all starved until it was just the mother and a 15-year-old daughter left. They made a raft and drifted down the river until a group of natives encountered them. The natives asked the daughter why her mother didn't have on any clothes except for a breechcloth, which is a garment similar to a long loincloth. The daughter told them that her mother boiled the dress because it had lice in the seams. It being early spring and rabbits not yet out and about, the mother said they'd survived on bark as they traveled along the river. As it turns out, one of the reporters of this story was a woman named Easter Sabatim, and this mother had been married to Easter's brother-in-law. Even more coincidental, it was Easter, her husband, and her husband's parents who happened upon this mother and daughter pair as they drifted on the river. The family bundled up the mother and daughter and took them home, but the daughter told them something horrible. The daughter, Easter's niece, said that they'd eaten all of the other children and the father after they died. However, the mother's statement countered this, saying that she'd buried her husband in front of the fireplace where the ground was still thawed. The grandparents looked grimly at each other. They'd both mentioned that when they first encountered their daughter-in-law and granddaughter, that the daughter-in-law specifically, quote, didn't look like a person, and that they'd suspected she may be a Windigo, but they didn't want to act until they were sure. This suspicion was further cemented when the grandparents discussed plans to go to their deceased son's home, but the daughter-in-law quickly told them that it was no use to go looking for the husband and children. Despite this, the grandparents went to where the daughter-in-law had said they'd been camping, but they didn't find anything. With no proof, it appeared the daughter-in-law had done nothing wrong. However, the granddaughter couldn't contain her guilt and revealed everything. She said she hadn't known what she'd been eating. Too weak from hunger, she could only accept the food that her mother gave her, until the day she had enough energy to finally notice that what she was holding was a little hand, smaller than her own. When she questioned her mother, the mother only said, quote, "Eat it, that is mitsim," which means meat. As to what happened after this confession, Easter confirmed that the pair was actually alright after this, and didn't pursue human meat after they'd reached safety. However, the people around them were careful not to mention Wendigos to the granddaughter, hoping that she'd been detached enough during the incident, and perhaps she'd been young enough, to maybe forget that trauma. Whenever the girl questioned what had happened that winter, or what her mother may have done, the community quickly deflected the inquiry, redirecting her to something else. Now we go back to fur trader George Nelson, who spent over 20 years amongst the Cree. He was in the company of a native who confessed that he believed he was turning into a Wendigo. Two of the other members of their band suggested that he be given draughts of their strongest spirits, and to keep him in a room right next to the large fire. Nelson expressed concern for the man, pointing out to the others that the man might be burned from being so close to the fire. The other party members scoffed. "Oh, no, if he is a real Wendigo, it will only do him good by driving out the ice. But if he lies to you, indeed, then it certainly will injure him. But it will be good for him, and teach him for the future not to impose upon people to frighten them." This is interesting, as this makes it clear that the native peoples weren't naive to the idea that some people might use the excuse of turning into a Wendigo in order to manipulate others. If the man was lying, then this would be a way to teach him not to scare people for attention. After all, this monster was very real to these people, and anyone using it to make their community fear for their lives would be a big problem. There's a fascinating story that saw the Wendigo being used as a tool to fight back against the steadily creeping Christianity that was making its way across the land. In autumn of 1895, St. John's Anglican Mission in Nebraska was under construction in an attempt to expand. Reverend Charles Weaver discovered a wooden effigy that was part of a Cree or Métis ceremonial site. It was created from a stump of poplar, carved to roughly resemble a head and a set of shoulders, painted red with 3 black horizontal stripes across the chest. These effigies were referred to in Cree as Manitogon, most likely made for the Pakak ceremony. This rite was a feast held in honor of ghosts who had died of starvation, in the hopes that honoring them would ward off famine and further starvation. Naturally, Reverend Weaver decided that the best thing to do would be to cut down this representation of heathenistic beliefs. The removal of this effigy was a blatant act of intolerance of the native people and their beliefs, and Bishop Richard Young, who recorded this entire incident, wasn't shy about revealing just how little he respected their culture. Quote, "Wapaska is a stronghold of heathen darkness and superstition, and, in planting a mission there, we have chosen a spot that sorely needs the comforting, humanizing, and enlightening power of the gospel of Jesus Christ." He had no idea what Reverend Charles Weaver had just started. In November 1895, a Saulteaux elder and medicine man, whom Bishop Young dismissed as, quote, having pretend communication with spirits, delivered a prophetic warning. Quote, he foretold that a Wendigo would arise who would destroy everyone who did not join his religion and come and place themselves under his protection. Removing ourselves from Bishop Young's antagonistic perspective, this call to action functioned to remind the local tribes of their own beliefs, and to not forgo their culture under the pressure of Christianity. Unfortunately, this method would trigger a catastrophic famine. You see, his warning was too convincing, and far too alarming. Bishop Young reported that many residents of the Athabasca district were so scared of a potential Wendigo that they refused to leave their homes to go trap or hunt, even if that meant starving. But not all of the native residents were scared into their homes. Nunapin, also known as Felix Auger, dismissed these concerns, and even discussed the possibility of having Reverend Weaver raise his children in the Christian faith at the Wabaska Mission School, which was then under construction. On January 1st, 1896, Nunapin cheerfully set off with his pregnant wife, Catherine Auger, and his children to visit his Métis father, Baptiste Auger, at Trout Lake. This wasn't a walk down the street. This was trudging through 50 miles of deep snow, muskeg, which is a type of North American swamp, and forest. On the second night of their journey, Nunapin, quote, saw something in the woods that evidently drove him insane. What exactly this horrifying thing was is never revealed or described. The following entry is from a report written by Reverend Holmes that was later included in Bishop Young's letters to the CMS. Quote, "At their last camp before reaching Trout Lake, her husband, who appeared quite well and ate his supper, suddenly said to his wife, 'See, look at that. It is coming to me.' He cowered under his blanket, and from that moment on was a lunatic. He told his wife that one of the children looked to him like a spring moose, and he wanted to kill and eat it. The poor woman sat up all night, not daring to lie down lest he should kill the children or her. Fancy the poor woman, alone, in the solitude of those dreary woods, all that terrible night. Next day, she proposed that he should go ahead while she drove the dogs. He consented for a while, and then suddenly stopped, saying that something stopped him and could not let him go on. She had then to go ahead. Finally, they reached Trout Lake. On the 3rd of January, 1896, Scottish clerk Francis Beaton was stationed at a trading outpost when he saw a stranger arrive. Beaton recorded his own account in the outpost journal, where he said that a man had come from Wapuskow Lake, but that he seemed crazy. This stranger said that he'd set up camp the night before, about 15 miles away, and had lain down, but, quote, he saw the devil come to him. He said that he must eat his children there, but his wife took away the child. She then took hold of him, and he told her to try and pray for him, and perhaps God would spare him to see this place. He said it was told him that he must eat them. He said his son appeared to him like a young moose, and he wanted to eat him. Beaton admitted that he didn't hear everything the man said because Beaton was busy getting the stranger something to eat, as he was under the impression that the man was starving. However, the stranger ate very little. Quote, then he told us that he knew someone put medicine on him, and that was the reason he was going to be a cannibal. Then he began to cry at the thought of it. The man's name is Nunapin. When word of this reached the native population, Beaton reported that they were terrified, as they agreed that sorcery had been inflicted on Nunapin. On Sunday the 12th, Beaton went to see Nunapin and gave him a dose of castor oil. He wrote, quote, he says his heart is freezing. He is always saying he is going to be a cannibal. He wants them to kill him all the time before he gets worse. Beaton wrote that, although covered in 6 blankets, Nunapin still shook with cold. On the 20th of January, he read some prayers out of his sick book to the man. Beaton wrote, quote, he does not look like a human being. He seems to be terribly swollen in the body and face. I do not know how this will end. The sight of him is enough to frighten any person. They summoned a medicine man named Yowemu, and the same night they sang over Nunapin, drumming up a rhythm to try to dispel the Windigo spirit. Beaton says that Nunapin pleaded for death, growing aggressive and uncontrollable. To protect himself and others, they bound him with ropes. Quote, the sound of him was terrible. He was calling like a wild bull. Despite repeated attempts to bind him, Nunapin was breaking through the ropes yet again. The group scrambled to decide what to do, the natives among them warning that if he got up this time, he'd kill them all. Beaton told them that if they had a plan, they needed to do it now, as he had no more rope left after their last binding. Action was taken swiftly, as Nunapin was decapitated with an axe and buried under a woodpile to stop or stall his possible resurrection. Let's go back to the beginning of these events, with the removal of the effigy. Nunapin was aware of that incident, aware of the Saulteaux elders' warnings. He knew that by disregarding these warnings, he was disrespecting his community's beliefs. This may not have pushed things over the edge, however, he then openly planned to raise his children away from his culture's practices, under the new religion that was already taking over their lands. Put yourself in his shoes for a minute. You're planning to visit your dad, but instead of hopping in the car for a few hours, you're hiking 50 miles of snowy bogs and woods with your pregnant wife and children. Mere days before this, your community had collectively decided to band together and shelter from a potential supernatural threat. Not only that, but right before you left, you asked an opposing religious leader who openly disrespected your culture to teach your children their religion. But now you and your family are too far into the woods to send for help, and your family's survival is entirely dependent on you and your choices. It's bitterly cold, and you can't seem to forget the elder's warnings of the Wendigo. He said that if the community didn't regroup and defend against this force, the Wendigo would descend upon them. And you've actively walked away from that united group. It wouldn't matter how many provisions you have, because you've made one of the worst decisions in this situation. You've chosen the desires of yourself against the needs of the many, the definition of how a Wendigo is made. And finally you realize, the medicine man was right. The Wendigo is descending on the area, but it's not bearing down on the community. It's coming for you. And so ended the potential Wendigo Nunapin. Still on the subject of Nunapin's story, we now take a look at author Nathan Carlson's family history and how he came to research Wendigos. As a reminder, we've mentioned Carlson a few times in these episodes, as he wrote one of our sources, Reviving Wetiko. Carlson's grandmother, Marie Ann Marguerite Carlson, was a Métis woman raised near Grouard, a native community near the northwest shore of Lesser Slave Lake in Alberta, Canada. Marie's father, Edward Beauchamp, was a Métis man who worked as a clerk and fur trader for the Hudson Bay Company, stationed at the Trout Lake Outpost store in northern Alberta in the 1920s. Marie told her grandson, Carlson, that while her father worked at the outpost store, a man was, quote, driven insane by a curse that had transformed him into a Wendigo. The man's condition rapidly deteriorated over the course of several days, becoming increasingly more incoherent and violent. For the safety of others, the community was forced to bind the man with ropes and terminate him with an axe. The Wendigo's body was buried under a large woodpile to prevent resurrection. But this sounds familiar. Carlson went looking through archives and was successful in discovering the exact report that corroborated his grandmother's story. The article was titled, quote, "A Wendigo Murdered. Canadian Indians at Trout Lake Kill an Insane Companion." The story read, quote, "An Indian, or half-breed, was killed as a Wendigo at Trout Lake in February last. His Indian name was Nunapin." The article would go on to report that he was killed via axe due to the belief that a bullet wouldn't be effective in killing a Wendigo. And, according to this article, the woodpile they'd buried him under was actually a number of large trees they'd felled on top of his grave. This incident had joined the ranks of cautionary tales that cycled through oral tradition, combining with other accounts. Carlson himself was told the story again by a Métis elder, Bernard Cardinal of Trout Lake, in April 2005. Who'd heard the story from a first-hand witness, this witness having been 12 at the time. The witness recalled that Nunapin would get worse at night, his body swelling all over. They tried to treat him with boiled bear grease, which made him vomit. This vomiting helped the swelling, and they kept it up for 2 nights. Nunapin repeatedly asked the men to kill him, as he didn't want to become a monster and hurt them or their families. This witness also offers even more detail to his moment of death. Not only had Nunapin repeatedly broken free of his ropes, but he'd attacked another man, spilling outside. They wrestled about on the ground, and finally someone managed to decapitate Nunapin with an axe to save the other person and stop this madness. Now here's where the story goes from tragic and scary to terrifying. The transcript of the interview reads, quote, "And he stood up. After his head was cut off, he stood up, and that old man says just blood, just flying all over, he says. Finally, he fell down." Bernard Cardinal concluded the story by saying that he, himself, went looking for the Wendigo's grave when he was 18. The grave wasn't buried in a mound of dirt, just logs, which had rotted by then. Cardinal mentions that he couldn't find Nunapin's head, but that, quote, "There's been lots of guys looking for it." I have no idea if searching for a Wendigo's head was a kind of test of courage, an act of macabre curiosity, or if a Wendigo's head would be a potentially powerful object to possess. but it's pretty gruesome any way you slice it. The case of Nunapin is an interesting example of a very public case, which included witnesses from both native peoples as well as a European. Carlson describes this in the following, quote, "As it stands, barring the possibility of an elaborate hoax, Beaton's first-hand testimony corroborates the above account on many points, and remains to be accounted for by those who dismiss the Windigo condition as an exaggeration or a complete fabrication. The behavioral inputs in the Trout Lake case match closely the inputs in numerous other Algonquian accounts, making this case paradoxically the most convincing and the most perplexing." The morning of October 6, 1899, saw Constable Chamberlain arrive at Luxeuil with a warrant for the arrest of Toucheyun and his accomplices. On the evening of October 14th, the men were summoned to the house of a Hudson Bay Company manager. These men were informed that concerning reports had arisen about the passing of their late chief, but the officials wanted to hear directly from the men about what happened. The following story was told by the men, and there were no disagreements or serious inconsistencies between them about the incident. One morning in, quote, "the big winter month," possibly January, in 1899, Chief of the Cat Lake Band, Owasukabig, summoned 4 men to his tent. After breakfast, the chief told the men that he knew he was going to become a Wendigo, and that they must kill him. If the men didn't do this or were unsuccessful, the chief knew he would end up wiping out the entire band. In the official report, this is recorded as, quote, "he had become possessed by a spirit devil." The chief spent the rest of the day begging the men to kill him. Eventually, he pushed so hard that the 4 men were in tears, but they finally agreed to his request in the late afternoon. The chief appointed Toucheyun and Anayokesik to shoot him, while Kakanapenase would stand by with an axe. Once the chief was struck down, Metupawitch would then set fire to the body. Chief Awasakamig was very specific that no portion of his body should be left unburned, else he rise again as a spirit. The chief then distributed his possessions to members of the tribe, made a bed of branches in the wigwam, spread his rabbit skin robe on top, and lay upon it. Awasakamig raised his right arm and pointed to the spot where he should be shot. Toucheyun fired first, then Anayokesik. The chief died immediately, and wood was piled onto his entire tent. They kept the fire going for 2 nights. The Earl of Suffolk was a traveler and author who was amongst the Cree in the late 1800s, and wrote of the efforts taken by the natives near the Waterhen River in present-day Manitoba, in Saskatchewan, and the Rocky Mountains. Quote, "On the neck of land, a Saulteaux Indian was put to death last year under singular circumstances. Being afflicted with some sort of madness, he spoke to no one, and apparently ate nothing for a month. His tribe took the idea that he was a cannibal, and after wounding him severely, buried him before life was extinct. Many hours afterwards, the unhappy wretch was heard moving in his grave, so they dug him up and burned him to ashes." In 1899, government official Charles Mayer recorded a Windigo case from the Crees of Lesser Slave Lake. Quote, "One Pahayo, the peasant, had gone mad and threatened to kill and eat people. Of course, this was attributed by his tribe to the Witako, by which he was believed to be possessed, a cannibal spirit who inhabits the human heart in the form of a lump of ice, which must be got rid of by immersion of the victim in boiling water, or by pouring boiling fat down his throat. This failing, they destroy the man-eater, rip him up to let out the evil spirit, cut off his head, and then pin his 4 quarters to the ground, all of which was done by his tribe in the case of Pahayo." In 1910, the Sisters of Providence at Fort Vermilion Catholic Mission in northern Alberta reported a Cree woman who'd proclaimed herself a Windigo at Little Red River. The sisters stated that this woman, Marie Bouchon, was nearly executed by her Cree tribe before the NWMP captured her and sent her to the mission for care. I'm unsure of what this care would have included, particularly with the limited knowledge they would have had about the condition in general. But Marie proceeded to violently attack numerous people at the mission. In a moment of clarity, Marie begged to be kept under guard with a gun, as she said she was feeling as though she would cannibalize someone that night. The sisters kept Marie in their care for 4 years, before finally sending her to a psychiatric institution in Calgary. Howard Norman, author of the book Where the Chill Came From, with the assistance of native elders to ensure the accuracy of his recordings, interviewed a 65-year-old swampy Cree man named John Rains, living near Duck Lake Post with his sons. Rains mentioned a man named Hoyt, who hunted with him many times. On one of these hunting trips, Hoyt told Rains a Windigo story that his own father had witnessed. Hoyt's father's friend had been acting very strange, particularly when he started to have loud arguments with himself. But this wasn't the typical two-person argument. Oh no. He would bend over to argue at his stomach, as this other being that he was arguing with was inside of him. This was already incredibly alarming, but things reached a whole new level when this friend stole all of the village's rifles, traps, and trap lines. With their limited resources, this was a devastating blow to the entire group. The friend proclaimed, quote, "I've eaten all the food out there, in the bush. Now there's only a person left to eat. It'll be someone." And with this, he revealed that he'd become a Wendigo. Hoyt's own father was the chief, and was now in the uncomfortable position to have to take action, quickly. One of the natives in the group warned the chief, quote, "It will get worse, and he will come back for us." However, the chief ignored this advice, as well as the standard practices, and sent his friend away. News came later that a man had been killed in another settlement while out hunting. The chief was consumed by guilt that his own decision to release his friend had resulted in the death of another. Rains concludes this story by saying, quote, "Hoyt's father felt very bad about this, about his decision. So he went to find this man, and he did." Now we come to one of the most studied events in the legal history of a Wendigo, Swift Runner. This case was extensively recorded and has been put under a microscope for decades to try to gain understanding of the belief in the Wendigo. And while this case isn't a catch-all to explain or understand all Wendigo events across numerous tribes, the ability to analyze this case can't be ignored. There's a lot of details to the events, so let's get into it. Canadian Department of Justice, Capital Case File number 1731 for the year 1879, The Queen vs. Gagasigachun, the Swift Runner. In the autumn of 1878, Cree native Gisikuweya was camped with his extended family, which included Swift Runner and his family, at the Long Lake near the Athabascan River. This was about 4 days' travel north of Edmonton, Alberta. This extended family included his daughter, Charlotte, her husband, Swift Runner, Swift Runner's mother and brother, Charlotte and Swift Runner's 3 sons, and 3 daughters. The eldest child was about 15 years old, the youngest being an infant of only a few months old. Swift Runner himself was over 6 feet tall and had a heavy build. He was well liked by the Hudson Bay Company, mild-mannered and trustworthy, described as a considerate husband, and he very much loved his children. However, he frequently had troubled dreams and repeatedly saw spirits. Snow had just started to fall when Gisikuweya and his group separated from Swift Runner's family. Louis Morano's extensive 1981 paper Windigo Psychosis states, quote, "If there was any underlying tension motivating this parting of the ways, there is no indication of it in the court record." And besides, as we discussed previously, groups joining and then separating wasn't at all an uncommon practice. While we don't know what provisions Swift Runner's group had, we do know that they had ammunition and guns, as well as knowing that Swift Runner, his brother, and his eldest son were able to hunt. Swift Runner had a reputation for being reliably successful with hunting and trapping, never lacking food. Everyone was in good health when the groups separated, Swift Runner stating that they were heading towards the landing on the Athabascan River. no one heard anything until the early spring of 1879. Swift Runner entered the Egg Lake Indian settlement alone. He told his father-in-law that he shouldn't expect to see any of the family again. Elaborating on this frankly alarming declaration, Swift Runner said that his wife had shot 2 rabbits, and when his back was turned, had shot herself. He said that 2 of the children had died and he'd buried the bodies, and that the rest of the family had left him. But then he also said that he tried to walk to Egg Lake with his youngest boy, that he tried to make a fire in the woods to signal for help, but the fire wouldn't catch. He tried to continue with his boy again, but couldn't do it, having to give up. He didn't elaborate on what giving up meant, and all of this information was incredibly confusing. Why would the mother shoot herself, especially when they'd just caught food? Did the 2 children pass before that, and she chose suicide in her grief? Why did the rest of the family leave him? But if that happened, how did he end up with the youngest boy? What happened to the youngest boy? These were far too many questions being raised by a man who didn't look starving. All of this greatly alarmed his wife's people, and they reported the issue to the mounted police. By the time interpreter George Washington Brazeau met Swift Runner on May 27th, he was already in police custody. Brazeau and a mounted police constable took Swift Runner to Edmonton for questioning, which began on June 1st. With Brazeau interpreting, Swift Runner told the police the following story. Swift Runner had become ill and was unable to move. His family began to starve as he'd been unable to hunt. This is already suspicious, as there were at least 3 hunters in the group. 2 of the children starved to death at Muskeg River. After burying these children, he sent his wife and the rest of their children ahead to Egg Lake. His wife returned 2 days later, alone. Swift Runner said she'd left her children at a different location. He and his wife went to retrieve their children, but found them all dead from starvation except for 1 boy. Swift Runner buried the bodies under leaves beneath a tree. Swift Runner, his wife, and the little boy camped nearby. This was when his wife shot herself, devastated by the loss of 5 of her children. The last son died near Smoking Lake. Swift Runner concluded by saying that there were 4 locations where various family members were buried, even sketching a rough map of where the graves could be found. According to this record in Morano's paper, he didn't mention his mother or brother. This entire account was incredibly suspicious, but the authorities decided to see where his explanation led them. Superintendent William D. Jarvis dispatched Inspector Sevier Gagnon, Staff Sergeant George Hirschmer, and interpreter Brazeau to escort Swift Runner to the grave sites on June 4, 1879. By the next day, the group was forced to leave their carts behind and proceed on horseback. Late in the day, Swift Runner told Brazeau that he was lost and that the graves couldn't be found. He then asked Brazeau how much food the party had, to which they answered that there was about 3 to 4 days of provisions. Swift Runner replied that this wasn't enough and that they'd run out. Brazeau calmly responded that they'd just have to find the graves quickly then. They found a trail that had markings on the trees. When asked if this was his trail, Swift Runner said he didn't know. He also didn't know where the first grave was, but shortly after, they came upon the area where Swift Runner's map said the eldest son lay. Inspector Gagnon and Staff Sergeant Hirschmer, who possessed medical training, examined the grave, finding that a 15-year-old native boy was buried there. The boy was severely emaciated and showed no signs of foul play. Inspector Gagnon reported that Swift Runner showed grief at this grave as they replaced the body. Swift Runner denied there being any more graves in the area, but Brazeau pointed out that Swift Runner had previously said that there were 2 more buried here. Swift Runner said that he'd lied before and that the rest were buried in one location, but that he wouldn't be able to find it. After some more cajoling, he finally pointed towards where the other graves lay. While their journeys so far had been fairly direct, Brezou and Gagnon noticed that Swift Runner had started to weave in his path, backtracking and changing course. He again tried to say that they were lost and would be unable to find the graves. However, when they asked him where a good camping spot was, he was able to direct them to an area 500 yards away without hesitation. The morning of June 6, 1879, the party reached the spot they'd previously been the evening before. When Swift Runner was questioned, this time he said that they wouldn't find the bodies because their remains were eaten by bears. In a confusing turn, Swift Runner suggested that they go to the grave of the last child. When they did so, Swift Runner said, quote, "I told you the bears would spoil the bodies." But then he pointed to the spot where his wife was buried. At her feet were buried 3 children, a 4th near a tree. Investigating the area more thoroughly, the police found damning evidence: human bones and pieces of intestine in the campfire ashes. Bafflingly, the area where he said his wife and children were buried held no grave. However, Staff Sergeant Hirschmer found bones and hair, a piece of women's clothing, and 2 pieces of human skull. At the remains of a campfire 100 yards away, more human bones and skull were found. They'd been boiled, the long bones broken to extract the marrow. There were small piles of bones all around the camp. Nearby trees were smeared with greasy finger marks. Swift Runner even retrieved some traps, a fire bag, and a kettle that he'd previously hidden in a bush. This evidence was collected to take back to Fort Saskatchewan. On June 15th, Swift Runner requested to see Superintendent Jarvis to make a statement. The statement reads as follows, quote, "I am going to tell the truth. I have done a great deal of harm. That is the reason I was backward with telling about it. I did not kill anyone else's children, only my own. I told you an awful lie. First I shot my son, the next to the eldest. The eldest died. At the camp where your men found the bones, I killed all the rest except my youngest son, which I killed near Egg Lake. I shot him through the back of the head. I shot my wife through the breast. The 2 little girls I knocked in the head with an axe. I choked the baby girl with a line. I know nothing about my brother and mother. My second boy I shot at a camp I did not show. A few days after my eldest boy died of starvation, I shot my woman and killed all the rest except my last boy at the same camp the same day. After eating my last boy, I came on to Egg Lake, where I stayed a little while. Then I came on to St. Albert. My wife said nothing when I killed my second boy. I never threatened before to kill and eat my wife. I told you everything I know I have done." August 6, 1879. Swift Runner was tried for murder before Magistrate Hugh Richardson. In what appears to be a genuine effort to pursue justice through fair proceedings, the jury was composed of 6 men from leading Métis families in the Edmonton area, and all of the proceedings were translated into Cree. Swift Runner was given the services of Cree English scholar William Rowland in order to make sure Swift Runner understood everything that was happening. But unfortunately, we see a major slip-up in these proceedings. Quote, "Swift Runner had no legal counsel. He asked no questions of any of the witnesses, called no witnesses of his own, offered no statements of mitigating or extenuating circumstances." On August 8, 1879, Magistrate Richardson and the jury heard the story, here written by Colombo in the 1982 book Windigo. Quote, "Swift Runner had taken the police to a little grave near his camp, saying one of his children had died and he had buried it. The grave was opened and the body found untouched. But human bones were found scattered about the camp, among them a skull, which the Indian was not backward in confessing was that of his wife. Upon being pressed, he then readily related the details of the successive murders he had committed. He had killed his wife and eaten her. He had forced one of his boys to kill a younger brother and cut him up, and this one he had eaten. He had then killed his baby by hanging it to a lodgepole, and while at his supper, had pulled the baby's legs to hasten its strangulation. In this manner, he had turned for food not only to the body of his helpmate, but to his living children. He also confessed that he had done away with his mother-in-law, who, he acknowledged, was a bit tough. It was said by neighboring Indians that a brother had met the same fate. What made his act even more barbarous was the fact that while he was indulging in his ghastly orgy, he had plenty of dried meat hanging around the camp. Magistrate Richardson sentenced Swift Runner to be hung on the 20th of December, 1879. One could argue that, despite the lack of legal representation, that the verdict wouldn't have been far from what would have occurred amongst the native tribe. Remember, key to a native community's efforts in trying to cure someone of becoming a Wendigo is that the suspected Wendigo must be honest and not withhold details of how they became one or what they'd done. Swift Runner lied countless times, trying to mislead the investigation over and over. However, you could also argue that maybe he would have been more forthcoming if he'd been confessing to members of the native community. However, he'd already had that chance when he reached the native settlement. Point being, Swift Runner definitely deserved legal counsel, but it's arguable that this would have been the result either way. On the day of his execution, Swift Runner was permitted to address the large crowd. Quote, "He acknowledged his guilt, thanked those who had him in charge for their kindness, then scolded his guard for keeping him waiting in the cold." And so went the end of Swift Runner. Now comes the tricky part: motive. Why exactly had Swift Runner killed his family? We have plenty of evidence that he should have been able to obtain food for his family, and it certainly hadn't been a substantial issue in the past. If obtaining food had been an issue, why hadn't anyone been sent for help before the situation spiraled out of control? Though Marano believes that Swift Runner would have eaten food if it was available, and that this was clearly a case of famine cannibalism, Brightman's article points out, quote, "Although starvation may have prompted the first murder, it cannot explain the others. Swift Runner's winter camp was no more than 25 miles from the Hudson's Bay Company post at Athabasca Landing. Swift Runner's father-in-law, knowledgeable regarding both the terrain and its traversability in winter, gave the following deposition. Quote, "Prisoner and his family were never so far away that they or the children could not readily have got into the Hudson's Bay post at the river landing, Athabasca Landing, without risk of starvation, even if no game could be found." As well, part of that testimony we examined had said that there was dried meat around the camp. If Swift Runner had actually been sick, as he'd said when he first spoke to interpreter Brazou, and his eldest son had starved to death, which was true by his body's evidence, then this would have reduced their hunters from 3 to 1. It wouldn't explain the inability for most members of the family to reach help, but it still would have added some pressure to the situation. Finally, we get to the issue that stuck with me the most. Where are Swift Runner's mother and brother? Swift Runner said, quote, "I know nothing about my brother and mother." I can't really think of a reason he'd lie about this if he had murdered them. Maybe he wouldn't admit to their deaths as being at his own hands, but he'd already acknowledged the deaths of 6 people, most being his own children, so I don't know how 2 more family members would make the situation worse. Marano concludes in his paper that the brother and mother probably went off on their own to find help during the winter, though whether this was before or after the killings is unknown. Knowing that would be the difference between simply seeking help versus fleeing being murdered and consumed themselves, or maybe even stopping Swift Runner. We simply don't know. Marano suggests that maybe they hadn't been able to find food and had starved in the woods themselves. Marano writes, quote, "Swift Runner's family was in a desperate predicament, and it was no easy matter for them to get from their winter camp to a place where food could be had. However, his brother was also a hunter, so he at least had the capability and practice of hunting game. And once again, we look to Brightman's paper pointing out that they weren't really that far from human settlements. Either way, the brother and mother were never seen or heard from again, to anyone's knowledge. In that piece of testimony from the court proceedings, it was said that both had been killed by Swift Runner. However, this is breezed past in the statement, and I can't find a confirmation of that anywhere else. It also doesn't mention any detail of their deaths or evidence of their bodies. Another explanation that Morano insists that we can't dismiss is mental instability. Quote, Cree Indians are just as susceptible to psychological dysfunction as anyone else, and it is quite possible that the horrible situation in which Swift Runner found himself drove him to an at least temporary insanity. But neither should we conclude that Swift Runner killed and ate his family because of a culturally conditioned predisposition that filled him with a compulsive obsession to eat human flesh. It's true that cultural beliefs and stories may impact people to go Wendigo, but it's very important to know that it's not being a native that makes you a Wendigo. This can shift all too easily into be careful around the Crees, they're cannibals, or other grossly drastic and incorrect beliefs. Another suggestion comes in the form of a private letter to Prime Minister MacDonald, which states, quote, there seems no doubt that the murder was committed by the prisoner, and not under pressure of starvation, but to rid himself of the trouble of providing for his family. Swift Runner had no trouble in all of the winters before in providing for his numerous children, and with the eldest son being of hunting age and having his brother to help, I don't really see this as a reasonable conclusion. This written statement feels dismissive and very racially charged, and the sources I've studied don't seem to find much substance to it either. The last theory is that this was a Wendigo situation, that Swift Runner believed that he'd become a Wendigo and was fated or had to kill his family. Notably, Nathan Carlson found a confession recorded by Father Hippolyte Leduc at the St. Albert Catholic Mission near Fort Edmonton in 1879. Swift Runner said, quote, at that moment, the devil suddenly took possession of my soul, and in order to live longer far from people and to put out of the way the only witness to my crime, I seized my gun and killed the last of my children and ate him as I had done the others. Some weeks later, I was taken by the police, sentenced to death, and in 3 days I am to be hanged. It could be argued that perhaps he was admitting this out of self-preservation. After all, if he admitted this was a case of becoming a Wendigo, then perhaps the Métis members of the jury would understand and be more inclined to try to help cure him. However, this confession was given to a European with no native ancestry that I could find, so what would he hope to gain from him? And we mentioned before that Swift Runner had a history of seeing spirits and having turbulent dreams, which we now know that dreams are far more important than a European would likely realize. Quote, Swift Runner's fatalistic resignation to cannibalism, sustained by a belief in the inevitability of a Wendigo condition, is an explanation for why he committed such acts, rather than obtain conventional foodstuffs. So if he did confess to being a Wendigo, maybe he really did believe it. In conclusion, did Swift Runner go Wendigo? I think it may be one of the more reasonable theories. Between the history of dream activity, seeing spirits, and the cultural disposition to believe that if it's revealed you were going to go Wendigo in a dream, then you'd have no choice. The group should have had access to game and weren't far enough away from help that it was out of reach, so famine cannibalism doesn't sound plausible. On the other hand, if Swift Runner had grown sick and his brother and mother had left by then, maybe there weren't many other options in terms of food. Without Swift Runner or his victims here to tell us, it's impossible to know for sure. This case remains an important example of a potential situation faced by generations of Algonquian peoples, now able to be recorded and reviewed. Today, we pore over it with a contemporary lens, now understanding the context, but it's still a mystery. This topic has certainly been extensive. After looking at all those cases, it's now time to try to get to the bottom of the Wendigo. How can we explain this creature? From our peek into the life of Native communities far north, we learned that it's an incredibly unforgiving lifestyle. Death never truly seemed far behind, and famine was constantly at every family's door. And remember, this was before new arrivals came from Europe and started to assert themselves. once settlers and fur traders started to take root, a competition for resources began. This was felt strongly in its initial stages amongst the Cree of the Hudson Bay lowlands in the years after 1670, which makes sense as the Hudson Bay Company coastal forts were just the beginning of the company's empire. Marano's paper references the words of Edward S. Rogers, curator of ethnology at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. Quote, "No longer could the Indians play one trader off against another as they had done in the past." I think I see his point here, that from a native perspective, individual fur trappers and traders could be dealt with, communicated with, and worked around. An entire company, such as the Hudson Bay Trading Company with hundreds of people in its employ, this created a massive movement with an enormous impact. As a side note, it must also be mentioned that this influx of Europeans also brought devastating European diseases, such as smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, pneumonia, influenza, to which the natives had no natural defense. The effects created a wave of hunger that spread up into the boreal forest Ojibwa people, quote, reaching famine proportions in the 3rd decade of the 19th century. That's an incredibly long time to struggle for food in your own lands, and I can only imagine how desperate these conditions were. It'd be no surprise if people started to snap, either from famine cannibalism or from the pressure of trying to keep their own families alive. Charles Bishop is referenced in Nathan Carlson's paper, suggesting that, quote, Wetiko mania may have arisen as a response to the European settlers. Fur traders and missionaries had no interest in the practice where native peoples allowed portions of their territory to rest so that game populations could recover. They were here to make as much profit as possible. There weren't many restrictions, if any at all, on how much game they could hunt, and the only thing that larger, wealthier European companies saw was a land ripe for the plundering, and the people who resided there could either get out of the way or be crushed. As resources plummeted, starvation became more and more frequent. This makes some scholars question if the reason there are quite a few records from European settlers was because their own presence and the effect it had pushed the native people to famine cannibalism. The further decrease in food and resources might explain the amount of incidents witnessed by Europeans, but from my own research and consulting with others, it only explains a portion of the existence of Wendigo belief. While I do think this theory is at least partially true, the belief in the Wendigo goes much further back than the collision of native peoples and Europeans, and famine has certainly been an issue since the beginning of the human race. However, while this theory can't explain the true origin of the Wendigo, it's where we see a crucial pivot of the symbolism of the Wendigo. We discussed how the Wendigo represented how important it is to prioritize the needs of the many versus the needs of the few, as well as to live a balanced life in general. The Wendigo itself is a manifestation of greed and consumption, and then this influx of strangers floods in, showing no restraint or consideration to the needs of nature, taking whatever they can because they can. What better representation can you ask for? The Wendigo evolved, using colonization as the ultimate representation of greed and selfishness. Jean Strandness says, quote, "A motif I have seen recurring in works by Ojibwe authors is that of the encroaching European voyagers and settlers, together with the US government and military, as Wendigo possessed. The new arrivals, quote, devour, to excess, literally and figuratively, trees, minerals, animals, land, culture, people, anything that crosses their path. As I continued my research, it was kind of astounding how well colonization and Western practices seemed to nestle itself in the warning of the Wendigo. A side branch of this theory is a point discussed in The Orders of the Dreamed, originally written by George Nelson in 1823. The authors of this republished book discuss a specific story as an example of using the Wendigo to try to fight back against this wave of colonization. Remember the story where Nelson was wintering with a band of native peoples and one of their party warned that he was becoming a Wendigo, how the group had him stay in a room very close to a fire? Nelson had raised concern over the man's safety, and he was told that if he was a Wendigo, then this would help him, and if he wasn't, then this would teach him a lesson for lying about something so serious. The book suggests that these possible cases of lying about being a Wendigo in the presence of a European may have been a tactic called a, quote, Windigo scare. Essentially, people would claim to be a Wendigo, quote, in order to gain access to trapping land or to frighten competing fur traders of mixed parentage. If this was true, this fake Wendigo declaration would weaponize the fear that this would trigger within the native community, as that terror would then function to further convince the European or partial European trapper of the danger, scaring him off. Nathan Carlson wraps this theory up very well. Quote, in summary, regardless of the extent to which starvation or alleged cannibalism is actually linked to the Wendigo condition, there is good reason to believe that, at the very least, the compounded environmental conditions of the 17th to 19th centuries, possible overexploitation of game resources, and the increased incidence of famine exacerbated the number of Wendigo reports. However, there's an interesting counter-effect to the collision of native communities and European colonizers. When faced with these Wendigo cases, some of the newcomers saw this as a prime example of the savages that they now rightfully feared. We see an example of this in 1848, when a Hudson Bay Company trader wrote this about the Cree. Quote, when starving, the Indian will not hesitate to appease the cravings of hunger by resorting to cannibalism. And there were some old dames with whom I was myself acquainted, who at different periods eaten several of their children. Indeed, some of them, it was said, had also eaten their husbands. With this perspective, the missionaries had more self-righteous proof that they were selflessly putting themselves on the line to save these godless heathens. It made it easier to ignore the vocal concerns of the native communities, as they were clearly uneducated and didn't know what was good for them or their land. This was described well in Michelle Litz's 2016 paper, Cannibalism and Contact Narrative and the Evolution of the Wendigo. Quote, where anthropology was once used, quote, cannibal has become the dominant terminology due to the preference of European imagination to associate indigenous peoples with the savage, uncivilized, and monstrous. Colonizers must transform these indigenous people not only into others, but into monsters, in order to justify the theft of the land's resources from the original inhabitants, as well as the unparalleled genocide resulting from their infiltration into the New World. We've already discussed this next theory in a decent amount of detail, but I'll very briefly summarize and add a bit more. Cultural predisposition. Algonquian communities saw the Wendigo as another part of their world, a non-human person, such as animals or plants. Under the right circumstances, a Wendigo spirit could descend upon anyone. The life patterns of the tribes also didn't help matters. Splitting up into small groups put immense pressure on hunters, but rejoining other groups meant that you could be near a malevolent conjurer. And in the larger summer groups, you were now surrounded by people who could all independently go Wendigo. When there are 5 ways that you can go Wendigo, and that's only the 5 that I was able to find and explore in episode 1, why wouldn't you feel like it wasn't a matter of if, but when? Nathan Carlson will wrap up our discussion of this theory. Quote, regardless, the phenomenon on the whole is here described as resulting from a cultural anxiety surrounding starvation and cannibalism, accompanied by the belief in the transformative powers of dreams, sorcery, and the Wendigo monster itself, which in turn resulted in the consummation of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We're going to dip our toes briefly into cultural predisposition, but from a racist angle, as that is important to discuss in order to understand the situation fully. Carlson notes, quote, it is suitable to suggest that the evident difficulty in accounting for the Wendigo phenomenon from within a Western perspective is, in part, the result of a reluctance to include Algonquian etiology in the discussion of the Wendigo condition. As mentioned before, chunks of European settlers and missionaries viewed native communities as ignorant and uneducated, and therefore their testimony for Wendigo events shouldn't even be included. It was far more acceptable for a European eye to be on the event in order to report it, quote, accurately. Instead of recording eyewitness accounts from anyone and everyone, and then considering every eyewitness account with a critical eye, they'd completely reject the perspective of those who witnessed and experienced the condition the most, the native population. It's an incredibly irresponsible way to view any topic or condition, eliminating massive pieces of information for the sake of upholding community beliefs about other cultures. One example of dismissive disgust that stuck in my memory was from a review by Louis Morano of Thomas Hayes' 1971 paper, The Windigo Psychosis. Quote, "From what he says, we must assume that had the Ojibwa and Cree behaved in a civilized manner and taken the trouble to develop symbolic expressions of the cannibal impulse, i.e. the Christian Eucharist, they would have been spared the necessity of killing and eating each other." So, just to review, in Hayes' opinion, cannibalistic impulses aren't uncommon, but other societies fulfill that impulse in a, quote, civilized manner. If only these native communities had the sensibilities of Christian communities, they could have avoided this overwhelming need to kill each other. Hay doesn't specify why Northern Algonquians would be particularly cursed with, quote, cannibalistic impulses, but his condescension towards the group is palpable. The notion that if only this group had focused their potentially natural cannibalistic impulses in a civilized way, the Christian way, they wouldn't have this problem in the first place. Morano continues, quote, "Hay believes that while we practice cannibalism only as a last resort, Algonquian Indians do it as the fulfillment of a basic, quote, impulse. An impulse they have especially strongly, either as a racial characteristic or because they lack the wit to invent symbolic safety valves that would enable them to vent their cannibalistic impulses harmlessly." And not only are the Northern Algonquians inveterate people-eaters, according to Hay, but he hints that they are sloppy and wasteful about it in the bargain. Honestly, I don't want to give a lot more time to such repellent views. But like I said, it's important to know multiple sides of these arguments so that we know which sides to discredit and stay away from. Morano also points out that, quote, Hay writes from the comfortable perspective of someone who has never faced a food crisis. Which I think is still important to keep in mind as we, in the present day, try to understand these beliefs. Famine cannibalism is one of the worst experiences any human can go through. And it's not an isolated scenario to Algonquian tribes. It's frankly wrong of Hay to place such casual disdain on the people who have the threat of such an experience present in possibly every year of their lives. And with that, we'll move on to the next theory. As we mentioned in episode 1, pressure in these communities was immense, particularly for hunters, as the survival of the family depended on them. However, they still had to respect the balance of nature and not overharvest the resources of the land, lest they anger the spirits and non-human persons of the world. It's a delicate balancing act, all while doing so as they tried to survive the unpredictable forces of nature with the shifting seasons. Strong emotions were repressed, as they needed to be focused and reliable at all times. And I'm sure we're all aware that the repression of emotions over an extended period of incredibly stressful time can have serious consequences. George Nelson had his own reasonable conclusions. He suggests that one who's experienced and survived famine cannibalism would almost certainly see a development of Wendigo behavioral traits, such as dissociation, anxiety, and/or depression. The guilt and anxiety within survivors of such a tragedy would push them even further. They'd consumed human flesh, so they now knew that they could very well become, or even be, a Wendigo. And so the paranoia would increase as they looked for signs of their fate. Such signs of this stress and trauma would start to leak out into the real world. Externalization is a psychological defense where the person would project their internal states or anxieties onto the outside world. As Sean Oldak writes, quote, "Through externalization, individuals can project their feelings onto external factors, situations, or individuals to cope with confronting their inner turmoil and negative emotions directly. By attributing cannibalistic desires to Wendigo's transformation, individuals distance themselves from the discomfort of confronting their conflicting emotions and the social stigmatization associated with cannibalism. The extreme conditions of starvation and survival push individuals to their physical and emotional limits, making it almost unbearable to acknowledge their own cannibalistic thoughts. By attributing these thoughts to a mythical creature, the Wendigo, individuals create a psychological buffer that shields them from the full weight of their actions. This not only offers a means of emotional survival, but also provides a cultural context for their behavior, reducing stigmatization within their community. This next theory comes primarily from Luis Morano's paper's conclusion: a witch hunt. I did a double take when I was reading this paper. I definitely didn't expect this direction. So let's join Morano as he sets the stage for this theory. In summary, we're all familiar with witch executions in Europe and later in America. Morano references a belief from Marvin Harris, a research professor of anthropology. Harris believed that the witch craze was a situation of stressed communities finding a scapegoat. In the midst of shifting monarchies, quote, "the breakdown of Christian unity," end quote, the shifts of employment opportunities in countryside towns, and so on, individuals of many countries and communities felt that they had little to no control over their own lives and the state of their own homes. Harris suggests that Europe's ruling elites used the fear of witches to rally the poor and destitute, giving them a common enemy that they could track down and eliminate. Morano argued that this was a community practice to eliminate those who could be viewed as a liability in a time of high pressure. Quote, "In an environmental context that allowed for a very slim margin for error, it became impossible to nurse the critically or chronically ill. In this way, elements of the Algonquian Wendigo myth came to be used as a rationale for triage homicide, especially when the victim was suffering greatly or in a delirium. The elimination of the elderly, the chronically ill, the mentally unstable, etc., would take pressure off of the community in times of high stress." Brightman acknowledges instances in the 1700s of the Crees, and in the early 1800s by the Saulteaux, of abandoning or killing the insane or helpless, who didn't have close relatives. In Eskimoan groups, the elderly would sometimes collaborate to determine the plan for their own execution or abandonment, occasionally requesting that their children do the deed. Brightman also takes special care to highlight that these situations are also moral issues, quote, "dependent on complex cultural premises regarding human responsibility, the consequences of killing, and the processes and consequences of death. These were not actions taken lightly, or with the sole purpose of getting rid of difficult people. These choices were weighed heavily." And separately from these select cases, Brightman pulls out records from Hudson Bay employees where many of them described, quote, "the Crees as solicitous of the elderly, maintaining parents and parents-in-law until their death, providing for widows and orphans, and rendering careful treatment to the ill." Needless to say, Brightman and many others, including myself, disagree with Morano's statement that labeling someone a Wendigo was an easy way to eliminate a drain on the community. In any case, Morano goes on, quote, "It is suggested here that the Wendigo belief complex evolved among the northern Algonquians as a way to help minimize the chances of getting caught in a famine with those who had already broken the taboo against cannibalism, to minimize the liabilities imposed by the incapacitated, and as a way of focusing group anxieties and aggressions onto individuals adjudged socially expendable." It could be a reasonable theory that people might be understandably wary and hesitant to weather together with anyone who'd survived famine cannibalism, now that they knew what said survivor was capable of. However, if we take a step back, we discussed how suspected Wendigos, or those who had survived famine cannibalism, were treated, and it doesn't line up with Morano's views. Sure, a lot of the tribe's reactions depended on several factors, but by all accounts, it seems that the majority of the time that these cultures tried their best to help the afflicted. Many times, those who survived famine cannibalism were viewed with sympathy, it being understood that they'd been pushed to a horrible edge, entirely out of options. So while it may be understandable that an individual might be hesitant to winter with someone who had consumed human flesh, the overall recorded community perspective that we've reviewed just simply doesn't align with Marrano. Note that there are numerous Algonquian tribes, and some may have different perspectives or reactions to such a situation, but we can only reach a conclusion with the information provided, which is primarily from Ojibwe and Cree communities. In 1982, Marrano concluded that, quote, Windigo psychotics never existed. Brightman points out that Marrano rejects all eyewitness accounts, dismissing them as hallucinations or fabrications. If he does consider anyone's perspective, he dismisses native testimony, labeling them as unreliable because the eyewitnesses aren't all European. Quote, Marrano suggested that reports made by the Algonquians themselves could not be trusted in their entirety. And furthermore, the seeming lack of any concrete documentary evidence by Euro-Canadian eyewitnesses supported the claim that the Windigo condition was a fabrication of the Algonquians and Windigo psychosis, a fabrication of academics. I understand that those of any community might see an event through a biased lens, but to outright reject all witness testimony due to the witness's culture is condescending and unprofessional. And even if we wanted to ignore all native perspectives, by now we've read through numerous testimonies from French fur traders, settlers, and missionaries that support in the very least a belief in Wendigos, as well as many instances of treating the condition and several cases of cannibalism. Quote, a more fundamental objection to the scapegoating thesis is that Wendigos were more typically cured than executed. For our next theory, we need to look at the potential motivations behind cannibalism in general: ritual, pathological, and nutritional. Ritual cannibalism is part of cultural practices, usually for religious reasons or funerary rites. Pathological cannibalism is rooted in psychopathology, usually connected to psychotic behaviors. Nutritional cannibalism is usually done solely for its caloric content, to survive. This is almost always seen in times of severe starvation and famine, where survival is paramount. It's the last one that's relevant to us in this discussion. In 1970, Vivian Rural suggested that the practice of curing a Wendigo by ingesting hot animal grease, particularly bear fat, was a way to treat a vitamin deficiency, which could have caused their psychosis. Rural explains that bear fat is believed to contain vitamin C due to the berries that they consume. However, the deficiency of vitamin C is called scurvy. Catherine Price's article, The Age of Scurvy, writes, quote, the problem was so common that ship owners and governments assumed a 50% death rate from scurvy for their sailors on any major voyage. According to historian Stephen Bone, scurvy was responsible for more deaths at sea than storms, shipwrecks, combat, and all other diseases combined. Sean Oldak notes a case in 1879 where an elderly Cree woman developed cannibalistic tendencies during a famine. However, once her adequate nutritional support was provided, her condition improved greatly. Malnutrition can also trigger aggression and agitation, making it challenging to provide other assistance to these individuals. If providing adequate nutrition can reduce drastic symptoms, then it'll potentially make them more receptive to other therapeutic interventions. While this conclusion seems fair enough, H.F. McGee points out a major issue in this theory. Why do these nutritional deficiencies, quote, manifest themselves as the Windigo psychosis among the northern Algonquians and not among their Dene, Siouan, Iroquoian, and Eskimo neighbors, when the latter undergoes similar nutritional deprivation? This is a good argument, and one that the cultural beliefs that we've discussed may explain. If you put the effects of these nutritional deficiencies together with the multiple ways that one can become a Wendigo, it may create a self-fulfilling prophecy. However, there hasn't been enough research into this theory to be able to definitively confirm it. And finally, our last theory. By the early 1900s, the word Wendigo started to nudge its way into Western medical knowledge. Early psychiatrists began to refer to Windigo when discussing patients who felt possessed by cannibalistic urges. Eventually, this reference would turn into a specific condition name, Wendigo psychosis. It's here that we pivot from cultural descriptions to medical, and we'll see why this is such a divisive condition. We'll start with Sean Oldak, who describes the condition fairly concisely in his paper as a culture-bound syndrome, rooted in the mythology of Algonquian-speaking tribes, and marked by an overwhelming belief that oneself is transforming into a malevolent spirit, and driven by an insatiable desire for human flesh, a Wendigo. The condition includes symptoms such as paranoia, anxiety, hallucinations, and cannibalistic urges, providing, quote, a unique opportunity to delve into the psychological underpinnings of cultural beliefs and coping mechanisms, as well as their relation to cannibalism. The beginning of this condition usually includes depression, nausea, and anorexia. The individuals begin to believe they're possessed by a Wendigo, increasing the levels of paranoia, quote, and violent hallucinations of potential victims in the form of animals to be killed and devoured. Further along, those afflicted may develop an alarming shift in perception, viewing others, even close family members, as potential prey. And finally, the consumption of human flesh is believed to complete this transformation process, though Oldak incorrectly states that this transformation is considered irreversible, as this depends on the specific native community's beliefs. Nathan Carlson wrote, quote, outside of the Northern Algonquian belief system, Windigo has alternately been described by academics as a culture-bound psychosis, a culturally localized manifestation of paranoid schizophrenia, a correlate of a scapegoating and witch-hunting behavioral complex leading to triage homicide, and a culturally mediated, quote, performance. But does Wendigo psychosis actually exist? It's a bit of a debate within the medical and/or scholarly community. Most papers written within the past 10 years, or those who study the Wendigo phenomenon, will say it's downright dismissed. As mentioned before, Marano believes that Wendigo psychosis is a fabrication of anthropologists, put together by the fantastic beliefs of Algonquian tribes. Let me put it this way. As unpleasant as it is, cannibalism and famine cannibalism is not special or unique to any culture in history. Some communities, such as those that live farther north with potentially less resources, are more susceptible to its reality than others. However, the belief in regards to what that cannibalism does to you, or what it may turn you into, does shift depending on the community and culture. It does not mean that one culture will become a horrible monster simply because of who they are. The Algonquian beliefs, as varied as they are spiritual perspectives of transformation, a way to understand how cannibalism occurs, as well as the consequences of not leading a balanced life. We'll hear more about why it's not believed that Wendigo psychosis exists, but you'll just have to wait a little while. Next week marks our last official Wendigo episode. We'll discuss the Wendigo in the present day, as well as the effects that pop culture has on Native communities through its obsession with the creature. We'll take a look at the representations of the Wendigo that you may have seen in pop culture. Until then, I'll see you next week.